Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we are going to talk about something that I've wanted to make a video about for quite some time, which is Gerald Gardner and the gays. So the title of this video is probably going to be something like, Was Gerald Gardner homophobic? And that's a misleading title because really the subject of this video is, given that Gerald Gardner was homophobic, how does that and how should that affect the way we engage with our memory of him as a person, with the sort of impact that he had on Wicca, and then with Wicca as a whole. I'm not really doing investigative journalism to find out whether Gerald Gardner was homophobic, because he was, and that's just so straightforwardly true that it's not really worth asking the question even. But I think there are other much more interesting questions about what we do with that information and what we should be doing with that information. For anyone who doesn't have this context, if you're just sort of finding this video, I am A, gay, and B, a Gardnerian high priest. Give me a sec about that. My air conditioning came on, and the audio quality on my videos is bad enough as it is because I refuse to buy a microphone because that would make me a real YouTube content creator, and I don't want to deal with that. So I don't really need the background noise of air conditioning. Anyway, I am gay and I'm a Gardnerian high priest, so I have opinions about homosexuality, the place that queer people have in Wicca, and so on. So let's dive in. First things first, was Gerald Gardner homophobic? Yes. Again, this is easily enough to discover that it's almost not even worth asking the question. We have this in first-hand reports from people who knew Gerald directly. So in her book, Dancing with Witches, which is largely about her relationship with Gerald Gardner, Lois Byrne, one of the high priestesses of the Bricketwood Coven, wrote, Gerald was homophobic. He had a deep hatred and detestation of homosexuality, which he regarded as a disgusting perversion and a flagrant transgression of natural law. That is pretty straightforward. There's not much arguing around that from someone who knew him directly and knew him very well. Likewise, you can take the words straight from the horse's mouth. In The Meaning of Witchcraft, Gerald Gardner writes that homosexuality, I'm not making this up, this is a thing he actually says. He writes that homosexuality is a communist plot to destroy loveliness. So that's great. That's real great. And there's an apologetic that you will sometimes hear from Gardnerians that personally I don't buy into. And that apologetic runs something like, in the 1950s, when Gerald Gardner was writing his books, he wanted to distance Wicca from homosexuality because homosexuality was still illegal and was considered a sexual perversion by the state. And because Wicca itself was already on such tenuous ground, they did naked things, everybody thought they were a sex cult, they were already in so much danger of police raids and people losing their livelihoods, he worried that if it were in any way associated with homosexuality, the arm of the law would come down even harder, and witchcraft would be in greater danger. And therefore, Gerald had no choice but to distance himself from homosexuality. It is true that homosexuality was still illegal when Gardner was writing his books. I don't think that is really what's going on here, for a couple of reasons. One is, again, we have the private words of Lois Byrne, who attests long after Gardner's death and long after the legalization of homosexuality that Gardner was just homophobic. And number two, Gardner was many things, but one thing that he pretty much always was is sincere. That man was not capable of guile. And there are a few notable occasions where he did try to fib, where he did try to lie, usually to make the witch cult seem more ancient than it was. And on those occasions, like, famously, everyone around him was like, Gerald, what are you doing? You are such a bad liar that it's not even worth you trying, right? Like, this was a man to whom lying did not come naturally. And everyone who knew him attested, again, that he was, on the whole, a very kind man, a very sincere man, a very gentle man who really meant the things that he said. So I think we do owe it to him, in a sense, to take him at face value when he says that homosexuality is a communist plot to destroy loveliness. I think that is likely a thing that he earnestly believed. And I think that Gardnerians sometimes have this impulse to leap to Gardner's defense in that respect, because we want to think of Gardner as having been a good man. And on the whole, he was, again, he was reputed to be a kind man. He was reputed to be very thoughtful, very caring, right? Everyone who knew him said that he was a gentle soul. Even there was a woman who sort of wrote the first nasty expose on Wicca and accused Gerald of being a fraud. She didn't write it, but she collaborated with the guy who wrote it. And the worst thing that she ever had to say about him was that he was a silly old man, and that he, believed things that no normal person could possibly believe about, his witchcraft being real or whatever. Like, that when they were doing ritual together, she thought this is all bullshit, and he clearly seemed to be eating it up. Gerald was a sincere and kind and gentle person. He just also had a blind spot, and it was a really big blind spot. He was homophobic. I really do think there's no way around that. And he was homophobic at a time where homophobia was de rigueur, right? He was homophobic at a time where it was illegal to be homosexual, where the general culture in the United Kingdom strongly associated homosexuality with sexual perversion, and specifically with, like, the sexual abuse of children, right? In the 1950s, in the cultural zeitgeist of the United Kingdom, to be homosexual is to be a predator who preys on children. And obviously that is incorrect, that's really bigoted, that's like a very deeply harmful stereotype that has done a lot of ill. But it was the thing that kind of went unquestioned for the most part in general consensus in the society that Gerald lived in. And he was subject to the biases of his time, as are we all, right? There are going to be people who look back at us in 70 years and go, holy shit, what the fuck was wrong with those people? And, there's this tangled question about, like, whether it's morally exculpatory to believe or do morally wrong things that everyone around you is also believing or doing. There's a question of how much do you get let off the hook for having prejudices and biases that were harmful and bad, but also that were considered normal in your culture for you to have. I don't have good answers to those questions, right? Like, am I thrilled that Gerald Gardner was as vociferously homophobic as he was? No, absolutely not. Not a fan of it. But I think there's a measure of forgiveness is not quite the right word. There's a measure of understanding that we have to extend to people in the past who were trying their best to do what was right, and who did not always overcome the biases of their time. Right? There is a sense in which we all still have a moral obligation to overcome, to be better than what we are taught. Right? We all have an obligation to look inwards and critically evaluate the cultural biases and assumptions that we acquire from the world around us, and to try to be better than the society that we grew up in, because that's the only way that we create a better world. but it is also inevitably true that all of us fail that in some respects, and that there is no such thing as a perfect person. I think that sometimes people like to divide figures, historical figures, but also people in the present, right? Like we see this with the way that we think about politicians or religious leaders or influencers or whatever. But like we like to divide people into good people and bad people, and we like to think of those as like fundamental, immutable character markers. So that if you have done something bad, if you have believed something bad, if you have held and acted upon harmful prejudices, that makes you a bad person, and therefore you are irredeemable. And that there are also good people who are perfect and flawless and have done no wrong and have all the right views. And there's no such thing. There's no such thing as a good person or a bad person, right? There are just people. And people make choices, and there are good choices and bad choices, and there are people who consistently make bad choices, and then that has, repercussions for everyone around them and then for themselves. And like, I'm not saying there shouldn't be accountability for bad choices, but the idea that people just are good or are bad, I don't buy that. I really don't buy that. And I think that all of us are, at our core, people who are trying our best to do what's right and who fail sometimes. And each of us fails in sort of distinct ways that other people can judge us for and maybe should judge us for. But each of us does fail. And we do all sometimes make bad decisions, hold bad views. And I think that part of just like being a person is learning how to recognize that in yourself and in other people, and then living with that. I think that when we talk about religion in particular, there is this impulse, there is this desire to hold on to some kind of purity. We want our religion to have come from a perfect, good place. And that means, A, that you get people on, whatever, TikTok is probably where things happen now because Twitter is basically dead. But you get people on TikTok who will say things like, well, Gerald Gardner was homophobic, so therefore Wicca is homophobic and is irredeemable, and no one should be doing that. So instead, you should be doing my Italian folk witchcraft course for only $249. And I think it's important to understand that there is no such thing as a spotless person. And that when we engage with historical figures in the past, or even when we engage with each other now, it is okay for people to be complicated. And it is okay for someone to have contributed something meaningful and good and important, and also have been, in some ways, kind of shitty. And it's okay to allow both of those things to exist in your mind at the same time. The idea that Wicca is inherently bad because Gerald Gardner was homophobic. That's something called the genetic fallacy, right? The idea that something is tainted by its source in a way that, makes it irredeemable. And it's just not how this works, for a couple of reasons. One is that there were lots of other people involved in Wicca. Wicca is not only Gerald Gardner's creation, and Wicca is not about Gerald Gardner. Gardner is not a prophet. Gardner is not a messiah. Throughout his life, whenever someone referred to Gardner as the leader of the witches or anything like that, he was very quick to correct them and say, I'm only a member, right? He is just another witch. He is a witch who was very prominent. He is a witch without whom I would not be doing what I do. And I am grateful for his influence. I am grateful for a lot of what he did in bringing Wicca into the world. But at the end of the day, he is just another witch, and Wicca does not live or die with Gerald Gardner, any more than Wicca lives or dies with Jack Chanick, or with Lois Byrne, or with Doreen Valiant. Like, Wicca does not live or die with one person. And I think that's important to recognize. This genetic fallacy, this idea of, well, Gerald Gardner was bad, and therefore Wicca, which he created, is bad, is not true for two reasons. One is that there's no such thing as a bad person. There are people, and people make choices, and some of those choices are bad, and we should respond to those bad choices accordingly. But there's no such thing as a bad person, the way that I think the internet likes to oversimplify and think that there is. But then, secondly, Wicca isn't defined by Gardner. Gardnerian Wicca is defined in a particular way, and it has his name on it. But Gardnerian Wicca is a tradition that was formed by a community of people that came together in the 20th century. And it is greater than one person. It is not a cult of personality around one person. So the flaws of one person don't define it. It is true that historically, through a lot of the 20th century, the general zeitgeist of Wicca was pretty homophobic, right? Like, that is true. There were people who were kicked out of Wiccan groups for being gay. There are people who were sort of allowed to be initiated, but maybe not allowed to progress past first degree. Like, shit happened. There was homophobia around. There is still homophobia in some corners of Wicca. There's still rampant transphobia in some corners of Wicca. Those things aren't because of Gerald Gardner. They're because Wicca reflects the larger culture that it inhabits. The same way that Gerald Gardner was homophobic, probably because he was living in a homophobic time and that was the messaging that surrounded him and he didn't really question it. Every Wiccan coven is made up of people who live in the general culture, who inhabit the general culture, and who absorb the biases of their culture. We like to imagine, I think, that Wiccan spaces are somehow above this, are somehow immune to politics, that because we are spiritual, because we are magical, we see past all the petty political disputes of our current day, and that is absolutely not the case. Because Wicca is a religious community, and communities of all kinds are made up of people who inhabit society at large and are influenced by and subject to the biases of their time. So the debates that you see within Wicca, the problems that you see within Wicca, are inevitably reflective of the same kinds of political conversations that are happening at the larger scale, right? Questions about whether gay men could be included in Wicca scaled directly with questions about gay rights in society as a whole, right? Those questions were really big during the height of the gay rights movement. They sort of resurfaced again when there was a push for gay marriage, but like, those two things are related. They're not independent of each other. And that says more about the nature of society as a whole than it says about specifically Wicca, or about specifically Wicca because it came from Gerald Gardner, who happened to be homophobic. Does that make sense? Similarly, right, like, there's sort of an ongoing struggle for trans rights and trans inclusivity in Wicca. That's because trans people are very much the scapegoat of a lot of reactionary politics in the wider world right now. Those two things are not unrelated, and they are not in any way essential to what Wicca is. It's that Wicca is made up of people who are bringing themselves to Wicca, and they're bringing their own political backgrounds and their own political baggage to Wicca. And the same way that Gerald Gardner did in the 50s when he had his political baggage, and that informed his theory, his understanding of Wicca, and he brought his homophobia to Wicca and said, there is no such thing as a homosexual witch, and there can never be one, which is a thing that he is reputed to have said to Lois Byrne. The same way that he brought his own baggage, we're all bringing our own baggage, and like, our Wicca is just as informed by who we are now. And I think we just need to create space for that complexity. I think we need to be able to create space and say, like, Gerald Gardner did some wonderful things for the creation of Wicca, right? Without Gerald Gardner, Wicca And honestly, the modern pagan revival as a whole probably couldn't have happened. Likewise, Gerald Gardner was reputed by everyone who knew him to be, in most respects, a kind person, a generous person, a caring person, a sincere person. In many ways, he was a very good, kind-hearted person. But like everyone, he had moral failings. And we can look back at him, and we can sort of reflectively understand who he was as a whole, complete person, what he contributed to Wicca, and we can condemn the things that were bad without having to sort of place a black mark upon his name and decide that he was a bad person and therefore needs to, be cast into the fiery pit and yada yada yada. Like, we don't do that. That's not what it is to be a person. He was a person who tried really hard, did some wonderful things, and still had failings, had deep, serious moral failings. And probably I, being a gay man, would not have gotten on well with Gerald Gardner. I might not even have liked him because of his feelings about homosexuality. That's okay. But, let people be complicated. Let people in the past be complicated, and let people in the present be complicated as well. Because this idea that there are good people and bad people, and that our religion is only acceptable if it is morally pure, and if everyone who touches it has been a good person, and there's been no bad people involved, it's just, it's childish at best, and it's Christianity at worst. So, that's all I have for today. I have lots of thoughts. I don't feel that I really adequately expressed them, but we're going to throw this video up and at least get it out there into the world. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you sometime soon. Bye.